Hi, this is the Business Guy, and in this video, we're going to talk about the top 5 greatest financial frauds in world history, who committed the atrocity, and what the penalty was they had to pay for doing so. And not only that, but in the end, we're going to talk about the most trusted countries in the world where you're least likely to run into financial trickery. Fraud, extortion, blackmail, embezzlement, hustler, scammers are all terms we're familiar with. Fraud or deception has been around since the start of time, whether be it for financial gain, political power, territory gain, cultic belief, or personality gain. Please click the like button below so YouTube promotes this video. Many thanks. And you can also click the subscribe button so that when more videos come out like this, you'll be up to date right away. Investors are always on the lookout for immediate returns and maximum earnings. Many high return opportunities sometimes look too good to be true. The problem is, sometimes there are millions of smart and wealthy investors who have fallen victim to some of these frauds. Here are 5 of the most creative, audacious, and shameless con artists and scam merchants. And I'm sure you'll agree, some of them may have just pulled the wool over the eyes of many of us as well, if we had the misfortune to encounter them. Though this is a worldwide list, I want you to notice the country in which all of them operated. Number 5, Charles Ponzi and the Ponzi scheme in 1920. Total scammed? $20 million. In today's dollars, that's $304,127,000. Ponzi from Parma, Italy, arrived in Boston in 1903 without a cent to his name. He was responsible for one of the most renowned yet simple frauds in history, the Ponzi scheme, also known as the pyramid scheme. The genius nature of this scheme lies in its simplicity, so much so that the fraud has been replicated in many guises to the present day. The scheme recruits investors with a promise of payments or services from enrolling into the scheme. Their investment scam promises of high rates of return with minimal risk to investors. The Ponzi scheme achieves returns for the early investors via the acquisition of new investors who will essentially pay off the early investors. As the number of new investors reduces, so does the amount of money to pay the previous investors. And this is when the scheme becomes unsustainable and fizzles out, leaving the latest investors with no return. Ponzi was arrested and charged with 86 counts of fraud and sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment. He died penniless. Number 4, Joseph Nachio. In 2007, total scammed $3 billion. Joseph Nachio, CEO of Quest Communications International, masterminded a $3 billion financial fraud scheme, and whilst doing so inflated stock prices and was guilty of insider trading. Nachio wrongly informed Wall Street that aggressive revenue targets would be achieved, whilst knowing it was headed for absolute catastrophe. He earned in excess of over $50 million in the process of selling stock. Nachio was convicted of 19 of the 42 counts of insider trading in the case on April 19, 2007. On July 27, 2007, Nachio was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. And coming in at number 3, Bernie Madoff in 2008. Total scammed $64.8 billion. Madoff masterminded one of the most recent and notorious forms of the Ponzi scheme via his company, Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. It was the largest Ponzi scheme in history, with prosecutors estimated the fraud value was $64.8 billion. Madoff offered modest but steady returns initially to an exclusive clientele via high-end country clubs and establishments. Madoff's returns were around 12%, less than a typical Ponzi scheme of 20%, therefore not raising any alarm bells. Madoff's strong reputation as a high-volume broker-dealer ensnared investors who thought his trading was cutting edge, timed well, and ahead of his time. The scheme began to unravel at the same time as the global financial crisis of 2008. Madoff struggled to keep the scheme afloat despite a $500 million investment from one of his closest friends, and it was his sons who eventually reported Madoff to the federal authorities. It is estimated that almost 5,000 of Madoff's clients were impacted. Bernie was convicted of fraud, money laundering, and other related crimes for which he was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison. Bernie Madoff died in prison on April 14, 2021 at the age of 82. And number 2, WorldCom and Bernard Ebbers. Oh, those Bernards. In 2002, the total scam was $74 billion. Soon after the fiasco at Enron, another giant, WorldCom was also guilty guilty of cooking the books. It was the biggest account scandal the U.S. had seen and also resulted in one of the biggest bankruptcy and redundancy programs. WorldCom also used creative accountancy practices and reporting operating expenses as investments. This meant that $3.8 billion worth of operating expenses were actually recorded as investments, massively impacting profit figures. It reported a profit of $1.4 billion instead of a huge loss. This ultimately led to tens of thousands of job losses and the collapse of the share price from $60 to 20 cents. A federal jury found Ebers guilty in 2005, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And finally, number one is Enron and Kenneth Lay Jeffrey Skilling. In 2001, the total scam was $76 billion, a global scandal at the turn of the century. At one stage, Enron was the 7th largest company in the U.S. with a share price of $90. Through some creative accountancy procedures, Enron managed to keep hundreds of millions of dollars worth of debt from its accountancy books. The fraud was done through shell companies, which can be used illegitimately for tax avoidance or to obtain forms of finance. Once the scam was unraveled and the investigation started, the share price plummeted to 70 cents and Enron collapsed, taking with it the 5th biggest accountancy firm, Arthur Andersen. The scam epitomized the phrase cooking the books. CEO Kenneth Lay died in custody before his trial, and his sidekick Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Now, there are plenty of good, honest ways to make money, so why do the top 5 scammers in the world we just discussed resort to a life of deception and crime? Like American showman P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute, and unfortunately, there are always fast buck artists out there willing to take advantage of them. Now, I really want you to notice this. All of these scammers played out the majority of their schemes from one country, the United States of America. In fact, I'm in the business of setting up international trust companies and bank accounts to protect honestly earned assets from the ravages of lawsuits. Many people tell us they are afraid to hold their funds internationally. Well, based on this data, maybe they should be even more afraid to invest significant sums in the U.S. The Global Corruption Perceptions Index, published by Transparency International, shows that the safest countries in the world include New Zealand, part of which is the Cook Islands, and Switzerland, which is in the top 10, both of which we utilize to protect client funds from lawsuits. Other countries on the list include Denmark, Finland, Norway, Singapore, Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, and Ireland. The United States falls at number 24 on the list of most trusted countries. So there are 23 countries in the world that have much more virtuous reputations than the United States, where you are much less likely to run into characters like we just discussed. So now you know the top 5 scammers in the world. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. We'll see you next time. This is The Business Guy.